Hello everyone, David Swindler here with Action Photo Tours and Outsiders Photography. Today, I would like to share 5 tips for shooting with long telephoto lenses out in the field. I love shooting with telephoto lenses for a variety of reasons. They allow me to capture great action shots. They let me get up close and personal with wildlife. And for landscapes, I can use those long focal lengths to really compress landscape features beautifully. They'll also allow me to kind of simplify a scene by focusing on particular details. And I love doing that when it can really express an artistic vision that I have. So let's start in with tip number 1. Get the right lens. Many people who show up in an outdoor shooting scenario come with a lens that's just too short. A 70 to 200 millimeter lens, although it's great for portraits, weddings, and that sort of thing, it's just too short of a lens for use in an outdoor type setting. Instead, I recommend getting something more in like a 100 to 400 millimeter range. They're compact, they're easy to fit in your backpack, and they have such a usable, workable zoom range all the way out to 400 millimeter. Now, if I know I'm going to be shooting something that's a little bit more wildlife intensive, then I'll reach for my longer 200 to 600 millimeter zoom. Although this is going to be heavier. The nice thing is, these kind of lenses I can carry in my photo backpack. I'm going to have them with me. And that's the most important part of having a lens in your kit, is making sure that you're going to have it with you when you need it. You can save your money and not buy those super telephoto prime lenses because they're really not as useful nowadays as they were 5 to 10 years ago. And that's because the ISOs on our sensors have gotten so much better. We can easily shoot at, ISO 3200, 6400, and so forth, and still get very usable images, especially with proper post-processing. So that one-stop faster advantage on the aperture side of the lens is certainly not what it used to be. Tip number 2. Let's talk about hand-holding. And so when I'm hand-holding one of these lenses, there's several things I want to make sure of. First of all, make sure that your image stabilizer or optical stabilization is turned on, and that it's in mode 1. Mode 1 will stabilize in both the X and the Y axes to give you the most sharp shots. Number 2, make sure that you are shooting a fast enough shutter speed. And there's this rule that's been out there for a long time called the 1/X rule, which basically says your shutter speed should be 1 over the focal length you are shooting or faster in order to get a sharp handheld result. For example, if I'm at 200 millimeters, then I need to be at 1/200th of a second or faster. If I'm at 400 millimeters, then I need to be at 1/400th of a second or faster. Now, how do you keep track of all that when you're out there shooting in a fast-moving situation? Well, there's a really handy feature on your camera called Auto ISO. And in standard mode, Auto ISO will dynamically move your ISO up or down to make sure you have the 1/X rule in your shutter speed. Now, the newfangled cameras, they have even more customizable Auto ISO features, where you can go a stop faster than the minimum, a stop slower than the minimum, or you can even set a specific shutter speed requirement. Then my final tip for hand holding is just don't take one shot, especially if it's an important shoot. I like to use the continuous mode, even if I'm shooting a static subject, and just take 3 shots at a time. And that way, I'm hoping that if I did move or something got jostled, that at least one of those 3 shots is going to be sharp. Tip number 3, let's talk about using our lenses on a tripod. Now, so often I see people trying to do this, where they will take their telephoto lenses and try to mount it with the mount on the camera body. Now, that's not a good idea, because we have all this weight bending off the top and unbalancing the camera, the lens, the tripod, the whole 9 yards. And if any wind comes, look how much that's going to move on you. Not so good. Instead, that's why we have these little lens feet on the lens. And it allows us to simply mount the lens over its center of gravity. Now it's a much more stable setup, and we're going to get sharper shots as a result. Another thing that I highly suggest is that you go online and find a replacement lens foot for your factory foot that already has the Arca Swiss mount built into it. That way you don't have to have this plate that you screwed into the foot that's always going to keep coming loose and add another point of instability in your setup. So yeah, just replace that out with an Arca Swiss foot. Now another thing I see people do a lot is when they want to take a vertical shot, they will do something like this, even if they have it mounted on the lens foot. And they'll go down and try to take a shot like that. Well, again, this is not ideal because now we got all the weight leaning on one side of the tripod. And it's not going to take much for this to get a little topsy-turvy. And if there's any wind, it's also not going to be the most stable setup. Well, we have the lens collar to the rescue. All we have to do is loosen the lens collar, rotate the camera body, and now we can take vertical shots to our heart's content. And we're still perfectly stable over our center of gravity. A few other tripod tips here. Let's say that there is absolutely no wind, which is important if you're going to shoot a long focal length. Well, if there's no wind, I'm going to come in and I'm going to turn the stabilizer to off. Because the stabilizer expects there to be some sort of movement. If there is no movement, sometimes it can actually induce its own movement and create a soft result. Second, I will make sure if I'm on a DSLR that I am shooting in live view mode. Because in live view mode, the mirror is locked up. If I'm shooting these long focal lengths and that mirror is slapping up every time I take a shot, well, guess what? That vibration matters at long focal lengths. You can't have it. If I'm shooting a mirrorless camera, it's not going to matter because now I don't have that mirror or that prism assembly inside the camera. The next thing I have to make sure of is that I'm using a long enough delay time. A 2-second delay is simply not going to be enough for whatever vibrations I've caused by messing with the camera or pressing the shutter button to have fully dampened. Instead, I find I have to use anywhere from a 5 to 10-second delay to ensure all the vibrations are totally dampened out. Now, you could use a remote cord. And in that case, if it's a wireless remote cord, yeah, you're not going to have any vibrations being induced. If it's a corded remote cord, well, that can still cause some vibrations that could be perceptible at these longer focal lengths. So if you are not using a remote cord, make sure you have at least a 5 or a 10-second delay to allow this to fully dampen out. Now, if it is windy, well, guess what? There's not going to be much chance for getting a longer exposure to ever be sharp at these longer focal lengths. So instead, I start increasing my ISO. And then I use the stabilizer on the lens. I will turn that on, and then I will take shots while trying to give it a little bit of extra ballast here with my hand on the hood, and I'll fire off multiple shots in hopes that at least some of those are going to be sharp. And again, I try not to drop much below like 1/30th or 1/40th of a second in windy conditions. Tip number 4, use your lens hood. The lens hood is the best protection you have for the front lens element of your glass. And the lens hood also can really help reduce stray light and flare that comes in. These telephoto lenses really can pick up a lot of stray light and flare, and you may not notice it when you're shooting, but it will certainly have an impact on the overall contrast of your shot. And these lens hoods are also kind of nice. Some of them will have like little windows where you can go in and adjust a polarizer without having to take the whole lens hood off. So just get in the habit of using it. The only time I would recommend not using it is, let's say I'm shooting in windy conditions. Well, in that case, I've got more surface area for the wind to vibrate things. In that case, I might be better off taking the lens hood and removing it. And finally, tip number 5, let's get creative. Let's try something new. Many people don't know what the stabilizer mode 2 is on their lens. Well, stabilizer mode 2 simply stabilizes only in the y-axis and not in the x-axis. This allows us to move the camera with a panning motion to capture really cool motion artifacts. And this is a technique called a pan blur. For example, let's say I have a subject that's moving from here over to here. Well, I could put my lens in stabilizer mode 2, and then I can take a ton of shots at slower shutter speed as I follow this subject across. And there's going to be a few points in that range where I'm going to perfectly follow that subject, and the subject is going to be sharp, and I'm going to have motion blur against the background. It's a really neat effect, but it's one that you're going to have to practice before you go out and do it on an important shoot. I like to use shutter speeds anywhere from about 1/30th to 1/40th of a second, but it all depends on how fast your subject is actually moving. Anyhow, thanks for tuning in. I hope you found these 5 tips valuable. And again, I'm David Swindler with Action Photo Tours and Outsiders Photography.